I'm someone who really struggles with ADHD. I've dealt with it pretty much my whole life. I'm not medicated, and while I've strongly considered it, it is partly for financial reasons, and so I have an incredibly difficult time focusing on particular tasks. It does affect a lot of the work that I do with regard to composing, but it used to be a lot worse when I didn't have strategies to employ to sort of mitigate the effect that it had. And so what I want to do in this video is share some of those strategies that I have learned to help me focus and write music more consistently. And this is not really for any particular target audience. I don't think it really matters if you're ADHD. I think we all struggle with focus from time to time. And composing is a really particular process that can be really difficult to navigate and to keep your focus on. And so my hope is that you will find this helpful in your own practice. Tip number one is to break your process up, or sort of divide and conquer, so to speak. So when I started composing when I was 14, I would not really understand the scope of the work that had to be done in order for me to write the music that I wanted to write. And so what would often happen is I would have a very short but powerful burst of creative energy and start working on a piece. Once that creative energy and inspiration ran out, it became absolute hell to work on the piece further than that. And I would still often finish the piece, but it was never ever developed. It was very shallow writing, and it was often like I was writing the piece so that eventually I could say that I had written it. The result of this was that I was writing a ton of different pieces. I wrote something like 45 different pieces before college started for me. The lack of focus completely prevented me from developing ideas and writing music that I could feel like I was proud of. Eventually, I was able to better estimate the amount of work that writing a piece actually took, and I'd give myself more time than I used to work on a piece. But still, occasionally, this same issue found its way into the work that I did in college. My first really large-scale piece, my Symphony No. 1, was finished prematurely in a state in which I knew my best efforts hadn't been given consistently throughout the entire work. This was something that kind of tortured me, and so I wound up revising it into something that I was much more proud of. Another bad side effect from this kind of work, where you rely entirely on your creative energy and don't realize the actual work that it takes to compose the best you can, is that you wind up learning not nearly as much from the composing process as you could. I believe that if you're a developing composer, you should be learning something from every single piece that you write until you feel like you've found your voice. And so this was something that was really detrimental to my progress in that way, particularly in high school. So what's the strategy here? How do you navigate a situation like that where you're constantly relying on inspiration and don't want to do any of the actually hard work? So there are a couple of things that have helped me a lot with this. I think the first step is to separate and acknowledge the creative parts of composition versus the not creative parts. And once you can recognize those, it's a lot easier to manage the way that you work. For example, if you're in a mode in which you're just wanting to come up with a bunch of different melodic ideas, use the time that you have to just do that. And then very strategically plan to use your composition time in a day or two to develop just one or two of those ideas. And then see if you can write 16 bars or so of full-fledged music using just one or two of those ideas. You know, this is just an example. The overarching idea is that you want to be able to recognize your own personal processes that you go through when writing music, and to divide those things up in a way that maximizes your time and productivity. Try hard not forcing yourself to pivot too, because if you're anything like me, you'll wind up just cutting your composing time short because you won't be enjoying the process. Obviously, if you're in some kind of a time crunch, then you need to be able to make an exception to this. It's a really, really useful skill to be able to compose when you're not really feeling it. But this is more or less the system that I use when I'm composing consistently, and missing a deadline isn't that likely to happen. Okay, so that's tip number one, is to divide your process up into different sessions so that the creative energy that you do have is being used efficiently. Tip number two is to experiment with different times of day. I'm a morning composer. 9 a.m. is when I feel the most creative, it's when I get the most done, and it's also when I have the least risk of deleting everything I wrote that day, so that's nice. But this is something that has changed for me throughout my life as a composer. For example, when I was in 10th grade, 11 p.m. was the best time to compose for me. When I was in 9th grade, it was during chemistry class. I still occasionally have late night composition sessions, but that's usually just purely creative energy. I don't ever do really difficult composing work if it's really late. That kind of stuff happens way easier in the morning for me. So another thing that you can do is experiment with this type of thing. Try composing at different times of day and see how each different time feels. It was definitely a huge game changer for me when I figured out how well mornings work, and just the pure dopamine of those first few sessions made it so that I could compose for like 8 to 12 hours, and sometimes that still happens. Tip number three is to make specific goals. Making specific goals is a great way for you you to ensure that you come away from your composition session feeling like you've actually accomplished something and been productive. It's also a great way to keep you focused on a larger scale. It's important that the goals are absolutely achievable. Like, don't try writing a symphony in one sitting. Let me give you an example. Maybe one day your goals are to decide on the general structure of your piece and maybe write 16 bars of a tune. The next day, your goals could be to figure out a number of different ways you can develop that tune, or maybe 3 different ways that you can harmonize it. You know, these are really dry examples, but the idea is that the goals are measurable and attainable. I often find that when I start composing with no plan for what I'm gonna do, I'll start writing having no idea exactly when I'm gonna stop. And sometimes this works fine, but it often results in me writing like 50 bars of music that I instantly turn around and erase. Which, don't get me wrong, that is also composing. It's just pretty disheartening to not have anything to show for hours of work. And so I think going in with a plan and being able to do a more rapid trial and error process by writing, say, 8 bars of the same stuff over and over again until I get it just right is a more productive use of time rather than writing a ton of music that I'm never gonna revisit again. Put your phone away, like put it in a different room or something. Tell the people you live with that you can't talk to them for the next hour. If you're composing on the computer, which is increasingly the predominant means of composing for a lot of people, close the applications you don't need. This is fairly self-explanatory, but I feel that I have to be pretty vigilant about my browser usage when I'm trying to compose. It can be especially difficult if you need to access the internet, which is totally a thing if you're composing in unfamiliar territory. Every time I wrote a saxophone piece in college, I was constantly checking the instrument ranges on the internet, and I eventually realized I could just put them on a sticky note, and so I put it at the bottom of my computer. Even something as simple as checking instrument ranges can be a dangerous game of avoiding Wikipedia rabbit holes. Go outside. If you're stuck and your brain needs a reset, taking a 15-minute walk can help enormously. Stepping away from something that you're hard at work on is a great way to recenter yourself, and even if you don't use that stepping away time to contemplate the work that you're doing, you're gonna come back to that work feeling much more refreshed. I took walks every day in the summer of 2020. That was like the single self-care thing that I did, and I managed to compose something. This might not work every time, but it works pretty often for me, and it's at least worth a shot for the vitamin D. Also drink water, just like a lot of water. I love water. Anyway, I hope you'll find some of these ideas helpful. I've come to find them to be very useful over the last few years. They have completely changed the way I compose and, in my opinion, the quality of what I write. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video and consider subscribing, and I'll see you soon.